Yes. In studio now, I've got a great friend of mine, Fred Fleitz, used to work for the State Department, worked for the House Intelligence Committee, and is now a lignit chief analyst. That's a great introduction. It's a great stumbling introduction. Why? Because he's going to talk to us about Syria, and he's going to explain to us what's going on in Syria, and if there's been anything other than a bumbling strategy in Syria. Fred, can you give us an overview of what you've seen happen over the last number of weeks? I think initially you were for perhaps a military intervention in Syria, and in the last week to 10 days, you modified that position. Give us a little bit of background here.
Thanks, Pete, and it's great to be here. Pete, President Obama has fallen into a trap expertly set by Russian President Vladimir Putin.
You mean the guy that just wrote the op-ed in the New York Times?
That's exactly right. And this happened because of the worst and most incompetent foreign policy we've seen on Syria since the Carter administration. Now, there's been so many failures, so many mistakes. I just want to focus on one that we've seen this week. Secretary of State John Kerry was having a press conference in London on Monday, and he made an offhand comment that Syrian President Assad could prevent a U.S. military attack if he turned over his chemical weapons.
You don't think this is a well-disciplined State Department coaching the Secretary and saying you need to raise this issue?
Well, clearly it was not. It was a comment that had not been rehearsed. It was an offhanded comment. Now, you and I worked in government for a long time.
I've never known Kerry to be offhand.
Well,
offhand comments. I thought it was a well-disciplined. Isn't that the characteristic of who he's been and what this foreign policy has done?
I think that's right. He also said that an attack on Syria would be extremely small, which sort of puzzles everyone. Why would we be attacking with an extremely small assault on Syria? But the problem here is that great powers don't make offhand comments like that. We have thousands of people working on foreign policy. How the experts at the State Department would not carefully consider and vet something like this really explains this debacle, this growing debacle that Kerry set off when that happened. And the situation we're in right now is that the Russians are now pressing Kerry to get the United States to agree to not use military force against Syria.
Let's just step back. I mean, he gave the press conference. The Russians jumped all over it. The president's speech was already probably written, and he was practicing. So after Monday and after the Russians jump all over this, the president has to go back and he's got to rewrite his speech. Some of us would actually argue as to whether he should even have given the speech on Tuesday night.
No, he should not have given the speech on Tuesday. He was going to give the speech on Tuesday to explain why Congress should approve a military attack, but he couldn't give that speech because Congress wasn't going to approve the attack. So he was in a bind. Putin appeared to give the president a way out, but this offer by Putin had strings attached. The U.S. has to agree not to use military force. That's a great deal for Syrian President Assad. He is already winning the civil war in Syria because of the aid from Hezbollah and Iran and Russian military aid. Russian military aid arrives in Syria every day by aircraft. So this is a pretty good deal for Assad. But we're seeing there's other strings attached. Assad said recently that he wants the Israeli nuclear program on the table before he'll give up chemical weapons. This is a deal that I don't think we're ever going to see take place, and it is an enormous stumbling block and delaying action.
There's a number of requirements, right? I hadn't heard the part about the Israeli nuke program, but that throws a whole new wrinkle into this discussion and debate. I mean, I've heard the Russians and Assad say, the only way we're really going to negotiate with you is if you take the threat of a military strike off the table. And the second thing is you have to stop all aid to the rebels.
I think aid to the rebels is definitely going to be a prerequisite for the Russians, and that the United States seems to be considering right now some of these points. We shouldn't be in this debate at all. We may need to use military force in the future in Syria. I'm not sure I can support that because of the incompetence of the administration. I was prepared to do that about 10 days ago.
They're bound to get one of these right.
Well, it looks like...
You don't have confidence that they're going to get this one right?
This is such a disastrous foreign policy. I support those who are calling for Secretary Kerry to resign. A Secretary of State should not make such a serious statement he apparently had not talked to his people at the State Department about. I don't think he talked to President Obama about it.
Wow. That's a scary way to be developing a foreign policy. But we got into this pretty much the same way, right? Many believe that the president months ago when he said, I'm going to draw a red line, that was an off-the-cuff statement.
It seemed to be an off-the-cuff statement that he did intend to keep. There was evidence, repeated evidence, that the Syrians have been using chemical weapons. The Obama administration tried to brush off the evidence, tried to say we don't believe the intelligence community, but there just became so much pressure on him, especially after the use of chemical weapons in Syria on August 21st, that this administration couldn't get out of it. They were really hemmed in by this red line.
So what happens now? I mean, we watched the whole saga of weapons inspectors, UN inspectors. We saw that whole thing unfold in Iraq. We saw how difficult it was there in a country that was stable. We may not have liked Saddam Hussein, but at least the weapons inspectors, could freely move around the country, at least within the limitations that Hussein set for them. Here you're going into Syria where, number one, we know they have chemical weapons. It appears that over the last couple of weeks, they've been dispersed all over the place. And this is in the middle of a war, a civil war, whatever you want to call it. What's the likelihood that we're going to be able to reach some kind of an agreement with the Russians and the Syrians to actually get the UN inspectors into Syria, and then that they'll actually even be able to do their job?
I suspect that there probably will be months of negotiations that will result in no chemical weapons coming out of Syria. And
if they don't come out, then Obama will have the authority and the moral authority to strike, and he will strike?
I don't see.
I don't think so.
I don't think the president's going to attack. But the point that you made about the difficulty of finding chemical weapons is key here. It's hard enough to do this in peacetime. It's impossible to do without a ceasefire. The Syrian rebels hate this agreement. They're not going to agree to a ceasefire.
And my guess is that once the U.S. agrees, this was a bit. And there's lots of questions about the rebels, and you may want to go there as well. We don't really know who they are. There are a lot of jihadis that are mixed in there, al-Qaeda units and those types of things. But this was a bad week for the rebels.
It was a very bad week for the rebels because the rebels are concerned that a situation's being set up where there will be no military aid. And we're only providing light arms to the Syrian rebels. That's not going to help them beat the Assad regime. They need substantial...
Weapons go in there from Benghazi?
I think that there's a good possibility that there was a covert program of weapons going to Syria from Benghazi, but we need to get the full details on that.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting. The president and everyone has said, well, finally we're getting weapons in there. I tend to agree with you. I believe that there was shipments of weapons from Libya into Syria. So the president's painted himself into a corner. Putin's taken the offensive. He's got the initiative. He's got the momentum. How do we get it back if we can?
I don't see us getting it back. I see months of negotiations that probably will not result in any agreement. I think the Syrian rebels have been hurt badly, but the big winners are Assad and Putin.
That's not a very rosy picture here.
As I said, I think this is the worst and most incompetent foreign policy since Jimmy Carter, and I'm afraid it's going to get even worse.
So we've got 40 more months of looking at this.
What really needs to be done is that we need a house cleaning. We need Secretary Kerry to step down. We need serious, senior, respected advisors to come in and exact some adult supervision over this administration.
It's really time for an emergency project to kind of, regroup on foreign policy.
This is an emergency, Pete, because Iran's watching this, North Korea's watching this, China and Russia are watching this. We know that Osama bin Laden was watching the weakness of the Clinton administration, the way they pulled out of Somalia after the Black Hawk Down incident. Our enemies are watching what's going on in Syria.
20-some embassies closed because of the threats a few weeks ago, an attack against our consulate today in Afghanistan. It's not a pretty picture out there, and the president and his team are going to have to regroup very, very quickly to get any kind of to be able to salvage this in any kind of a way, and not a high probability.
I don't think there's a high probability, and I think the onus right now, I think, is on Congress to press this administration to make significant changes in policy and in personnel to salvage what I think is just an utter debacle in foreign policy.
Not a great story, but Fred, thanks for your insights. Thanks for joining us. Coming up after the break, John Fund will be joining me in studio to discuss politically how well the president handled Syria. I'm Pete Hoekstra, filling in for Steve Malzberg on the Malzberg TV and Radio Network.